Dot for Short by Frieda Friedman. Illustrated by Carolyn Haywood. Copyright 1947. Chapter 7. Dot Shares a Secret. Promotion day came at the end of June, and all the Flemings were promoted. In September, Dot would be in the 6th grade, Fluff in the 8th, and Peg would be a sophomore in high school. A sophomore in high school! How grown up that sounded, thought Dot. As soon as the summer vacation started, Peg, Fluff, and Mike, especially Mike, said over and over again that they wished it would last forever. Dot didn't tell them that every once in a while, when the day was very hot and there was nothing exciting to do, she really wished that school would start again. That was how she felt one day in the middle of July. The day had been hot and sticky, just as yesterday had been and the day before. It was the kind of day in which you do nothing, but you feel tired. Peg, Fluff, Dot, and Mike had been indoors all day, and they were bored and restless. At about 4:30, Mike yelled, "Hooray! The curtains are moving! That means a breeze!" Peg jumped up and said maybe it was cool enough to do something. She'd walk over onto 2nd Avenue and visit her friend Adele. Mike decided he'd go down to the candy store and buy a 3-cent soda. Fluff thought she'd wash her hair, and Dot decided to take a walk. Mommy reminded her to make it a short walk because, even though the curtain had fluttered weakly, the day was still hot. Grandma reminded them all to be home for a 6 o'clock supper. Dot put on her hat to keep the sun off her head and started her walk. This was to be what Dot, in her own mind, called a just-for-fun walk. It was the nicest walk of any. Usually Dot's walks were for something definite, like running an errand, going to the library, to school, or to call for a friend. Then you had something on your mind, and you were eager to get to a definite place. On a just-for-fun walk, you strolled along, turning anywhere you pleased, looking into windows, and wondering about the people you saw. Dot turned a corner. She compared the houses on one block with those on the other side. She looked at the women who were sitting on camp chairs in front of the old, worn buildings. Most of the women kept wiping their perspiring foreheads with big handkerchiefs. Dot guessed that they, like Pierre, must live in tiny rear apartments that were almost unbearably hot these July days. Continuing her walk, Dot smiled at fat babies in strollers and looked into shop windows. While she was walking and looking, she kept playing her favorite game, planning what she would be when she was grown up. The one thing Dot really wanted to be more than anything else was a poet. She imagined a girl about her own age some day walking into the public library and looking on the shelves. The girl she was picturing frowned, searched some more, and then hesitantly walked over to where the librarian was stamping cards. "Have you any of Dorothea Ann Fleming's books?" the girl asked. The librarian looked exasperated when she heard the name. "We have so many calls for Miss Fleming's books that we can't keep them on the shelves," she explained. "Would you like to reserve one?" That was Dot's favorite daydream. She never tired of it. In her mind she could see the other girl in the library dipping her pen into the glass inkwell and filling out a reservation card for Dorothea Ann Fleming's latest book of poems. Feeling very happy, Dot turned a corner and found herself on a street of clean, well-kept houses. There weren't so many people sitting in front of them, and there wasn't so much traffic on this street. Toward the end of the block, Dot saw a parked taxi that was the same make as Daddy's. Like Daddy's taxi, it had a big spare tire on the back. Wouldn't it be fun if it really was Daddy's cab? Dot hurried a little, excited at the thought of meeting her father in the middle of the day. She hadn't done that since way back in January. Then his passenger had been Mrs. Roberts, and because of that meeting Dot had gained 2 things, a friend and a beautiful winter coat. The friend was Margie Roberts, who had outgrown the coat. She and Dot sometimes visited each other. The last time Margie had visited the Flemings, Pierre had been there too, and Margie had seemed to like him very much. When Dot was near enough to see the license plate, she realized that this really was Daddy's cab. Under the letters NY and the year, there was a number that all the Flemings, from Grandma to Mike, knew well, 38-215. There was no sign of Daddy, so Dot guessed that he must have a passenger, probably a woman with luggage, and he must be helping her up the stairs. Poor Daddy! This was too hot a day to carry heavy luggage up 5 flights of stairs, even if a big tip was the result. Dot leaned against the side of the cab, feeling important because it was her father's. How surprised he'd be when he saw her. She could see his face when he came down the stairs and found her standing there. First he would look puzzled, then a big grin would spread across his freckled face, and he would throw back his red head and laugh with pleasure. What could be taking him so long? Dot looked at the door of the building, expecting Daddy to come out any minute. Then, tired of staring at one place, her eyes moved to the window at the right of the entrance. In that window was a small, neat sign. It said Herbert L. Morse, M.D. Dot had seen many doctor signs in the neighborhood, and she didn't know why this particular one should give her a sudden feeling of fright. She found herself feeling unbearably hot, although the sun was not as strong as it had been. She dried her forehead and her hands on her handkerchief. It's the weather, she told herself. I shouldn't have gone out on such a hot day. Then her heart gave a bounce as the door opened. Daddy came out. He was frowning and looking down at the steps, and he was so busy with his own thoughts that he did not even notice Dot until he was close to the taxi. Then his face lit up and he grinned just as Dot knew that he would. Imagine finding you here, he said. Jump in the cab and I'll drive you home. Want to sit in the back and be a passenger? No, I want to sit in front with you, Dot told him, and she got into the cab and slid past the wheel. I've been waiting an awful long time for you to come out, she said as Daddy got in. At first I thought that maybe you were helping an old lady carry her suitcase all the way to the top floor. Were you? Daddy put his foot on the accelerator. It made a harsh, rasping noise that drowned out his answer. The car started, but when it had gone about half a block, a man waved his hand to show that he wanted to get in. Daddy pulled up to the curb and stopped the car. The man opened the door, put one leg in, and then looked at Dot in surprise. Oh, you've got a passenger, he said. She's so little that I didn't even notice her. In spite of the many resolutions she had made not to be annoyed when anyone called her little, Dot found herself disliking the man who had used the word. His voice was unpleasant. It sounded as if he had a cold. Daddy laughed good-naturedly. Jump in, he said. You don't mind if my daughter comes along, do you? Where to? The man settled himself in the back seat, clutched the strap as if he were sure that Daddy was going to drive recklessly, and then gave an address. For a few minutes no one said anything, and then the man in the back seat said, Say, is that really your picture up there? He sounded suspicious. No, Daddy said. It's my grandmother on my father's side. The man didn't laugh. I never saw a cab driver who looked like his picture, he said in an annoyed voice, as if taking a poor picture were a serious crime. Take that one of you, for instance, he said. He waved his hand toward the picture on Daddy's license. Daddy honked the horn loudly as he passed a slow-moving truck. He was looking straight ahead, too busy driving to pay any attention to his passenger. The man in the back seat continued talking. That looks more like a picture of your nephew than of you. I haven't any nephew, said Daddy. Dot noticed that his voice was not as gay as usual. She didn't know whether he was joking with the man or not. Her eyes went up to the picture and then to Daddy's face. Why, Daddy really didn't look like that picture. The man was right. Daddy's face was much thinner, and there were lines around his mouth that didn't show in the photograph. When the photograph had been taken, about 8 months ago, all the Flemings had thought it was very good. The feeling of fear that Dot had known when she saw the little white sign in the ground floor window came back again, stronger now than before. Here we are, said Daddy. He pulled up in front of an apartment house, and hardly turning, he reached his long arm back and opened the rear door. The man took out some coins and told Daddy to keep the change. Daddy mumbled, Thank you, in a voice that did not seem like his own cheerful one, and then he started for home. Neither Dot nor Daddy said anything for a while. Dot had the same feeling that she had had the night she recited in the assembly back in April. She remembered Daddy had come home early that evening, and Mommy had mentioned that he didn't look well. She remembered Daddy had said he came home early to shave. That was the first time Dot had realized that he didn't look like his cheerful, gay self. She had often thought so since that evening. Daddy interrupted her thoughts. Awfully quiet, aren't you? Daddy, that house you were parked in front of when I met you, did you have a passenger living there? Instead of being a poet, you ought to be a lawyer, said Daddy. You'd be good at cross-examining. It was plain to Dot that her father was trying to avoid her question. This time she'd be more direct. Is anything wrong, Daddy? What would make you think such a silly thing? Dot was sure there was something wrong, or Daddy would not be trying so hard not to answer her questions. She'd have to try again, and this time she'd ask the question she had been trying to avoid. It really wasn't a question, for by now Dot was sure of the answer. Daddy, you went to see the doctor on the ground floor, didn't you? What did he say? To Dot's surprise, her father burst out laughing. He sounded so natural that she felt all her fears had been foolish and probably imaginary. Grandma often told her that she had too much imagination. You sound like your mother when she's got something on her mind, Daddy said. She just keeps at me till she finds out what she wants to know. They were on Third Avenue now, a few blocks from home. In driving the passenger where he wanted to go, Daddy had driven about a mile from the Fleming house. Is there something I can do? Persisted Dot. If only Daddy would tell her what was wrong. Yes, Daddy said. You can keep my visit to the doctor a secret from everyone, including your mother and grandmother. I don't want them to worry. Suddenly Daddy started to talk quickly, as if he had to tell someone his problem. The doctor says my heart's not what it should be. It's nothing serious, but he thinks I ought to go away for the winter. Florida, he suggested. Daddy laughed as he said this, but his laugh was not a happy one. He didn't tell me who'd support my family while I was away. That's not his problem. Say, isn't that Pierre over there? Daddy sounded glad to be able to change the subject. He tooted his horn until Pierre turned. Then he pulled up to the curb and stopped. Jump in, Pierre, and I'll drive you home, said Daddy, seeming very pleased to have met Pierre. Dot's friend needed no second invitation. He chuckled with delight as he sat down. Imagine what the people sitting in front of my house will say when I emerge from the taxi, he said. Then he looked at Dot's face. Is there something wrong? He asked. It was Daddy who answered. Not a thing, not a thing. Pierre looked hard at Dot again, and she knew that he knew there was something wrong. Daddy stopped in front of the house where Pierre lived and opened the door for him as if he were a real passenger. The women who were sitting on camp chairs in front of the building stretched their necks and stared at Pierre as Pierre came toward them. They looked as if they couldn't believe their eyes. Daddy and Dot burst out laughing. After her worry and tension, the laugh made Dot feel better. She could not explain her change of feeling, but all at once she knew there must be a way for Daddy to go to Florida. She didn't know what it was yet, but she would find out before winter. Now they were parking in front of the building where they lived. The brake squealed as Daddy stopped the cab. Dot was just about to open the door when it was thrown open by someone outside. Mike's red head looked into the taxi. Gosh, you went for a ride and I didn't, he complained to Dot. Was it a long ride? Too long, I'm afraid, said Daddy, reaching a hand out and pulling Mike's red hair. You kids go upstairs and cool off. I'll cruise around a little more. Remember, Dot, we've got a secret. On the way up the creaking stairs, Mike kept trying to get Dot to tell the secret. Is it about me? He asked. Did Daddy get me a dog? Am I right or wrong? Wrong, said Dot, wishing the secret were nothing more than a dog for Mike. It seemed years since she had taken that just-for-fun walk. She felt twice as old now as she had an hour ago. Sharing a secret that she couldn't tell Mommy or Grandma was a big responsibility. It was her responsibility, hers only. She must do something to help. But what? Mike put a finger on the doorbell and kept it there. Dot could hear the ring resound through the apartment. She could hear Grandma's footsteps coming towards the door. Dot was glad that the hall was dark, so Grandma couldn't read her face. Grandma would surely guess that there was something bothering her, just as Pierre had guessed. She hurried into the bedroom, thinking, now I know what it feels like to be grown up. Chapter 8. Pierre Leaves a Magazine. Dot couldn't get her conversation with Daddy out of her mind. In the middle of reading, walking, playing, or helping in the house, her thoughts kept returning to the same problem. How to get enough money by winter so that Daddy could go south. She thought of it while she was dressing in the morning, and it was her last thought before she fell asleep at night. One morning at breakfast, she hadn't realized how far away her thoughts were until she heard Mike say, Hey, Dot, are you getting deaf? I asked you 3 times to pass the butter. Dot's got something on her mind, teased Fluff. Is it a new boyfriend or the same old Pierre? Dot blushed and tried not to meet Daddy's eyes. She knew that Daddy would know what was troubling her. If only she could hide her worries the way he did. He was so gay and cheerful that sometimes Dot thought her meeting with him in front of the doctor's office must have been a bad dream. At other times, though, she knew it wasn't a dream at all. One day when Daddy went into the bedroom, Mommy followed. From her own bedroom, Dot heard Mommy's voice saying anxiously, "Jim, are you sure you're feeling all right? You don't look well." Dot heard Daddy laugh loudly and answer, "You're getting an imagination as bad as Dot's. I never felt better." That evening he slammed the door extra hard to show how strong he was. Dot's thoughts always went around in a circle, and they were always the same. If Daddy was not to get sick, then he must go away this winter. In order to get away, he needed money. The only way he could get money was by driving the taxi in New York. That meant being up north for the winter. Dot mopped the perspiration from her forehead. It couldn't be as hopeless as that, she thought desperately. There must be a way, and it was up to her to find it, because she was the only one of the Flemings who knew the problem. For a minute Dot remembered Pierre's face as he studied her in the taxi that day she had met Daddy. Pierre did not know Dot's problem, of course, but Dot thought he suspected that she had one. It made her feel better somehow to know that Pierre was sympathetic. One Friday night, when they were all at dinner, Fluff said, "Daddy, would it be okay for me to take care of a baby tomorrow evening?" Daddy had plunged his fork into a slice of cheese and had raised it to his mouth. He was so surprised at Fluff's question that he held the fork as if he were holding a little yellow flag on a silver pole. A Third Avenue L train passed, and the room quivered a little as it always did when a train rushed by. The slice of cheese trembled like a flag in the breeze. "Who's the baby, and why doesn't its mother take care of it?" Daddy asked. Fluff explained that the mother was a friend of her teacher's. The baby's mother and father wanted to go out for the evening, and they wanted someone to be in the house. They would pay Fluff $1 and would leave her books to read and candy and fruit to eat. And, Fluff continued, Daddy could call for her at 11 and drive her home. Everyone looked at Fluff with admiration. "Gosh, a whole buck for eating books and reading fruit. Eating fruit and reading books," said Mike enviously. "Nothing like that ever happens to me." Dot had a feeling of hopeful excitement. "Do you think your teacher knows another baby I could take care of?" she asked. Fluff looked down at her sister in her most superior manner. "Heavens, you're too small and too young," she said. "The mothers wouldn't trust you." Dot's dark brown eyes blazed with humiliation and anger. After all, Fluff was only 2 years older, even though she was more than 2 years taller. It wasn't fair not to be trusted because you happened to be small. As usual, Grandma read her thoughts, although Dot hadn't said a word. "Dorothea Ann, you'll have plenty of time to earn money," Grandma said. "Don't be in too much of a rush. In 2 years you can take care of babies too." 2 years! What a long time, thought Dot. Too long if she was going to help Daddy. In fact, thought Dot, even if she did get a Saturday job every Saturday until winter, she would not have enough money to send Daddy to Florida. Peg had been toying with her salad. Now she said, "If Fluff works Saturday evening, I think I will too. The 5 and 10 cent store always needs extras." Mike had been paying more attention to his plate than to the conversation. Now he surveyed the plate with admiration. There was nothing on it, not even a drop of mayonnaise. "You really don't have to wash my plate, Mommy," he said. Then he turned to the others and announced that if they were going to work tomorrow evening, he would deliver orders for Minton's. They always needed an extra guy to deliver things. Mommy looked from one to the other affectionately and said to Daddy, "Before we know it, we'll be millionaires. You can retire, Jim, and the children will support us." Dot thought that Daddy's laugh, although it was loud enough, did not sound quite natural. When Saturday evening came, Dot could feel the excitement in the house. It filled every room. Fluff wore her newest dress as if she were going to a party instead of going to take care of a baby. Peg brushed her reddish hair until it shone. After all, she said to Fluff, some of the boys from her school might drop in to the store. Mike asked if he could have 2 portions of dessert because he needed extra strength. In this air of hustle and excitement, Dot felt smaller and less important than ever. That morning she had been to the library, and she had brought a thick book home, something to keep her busy during the evening. Now she found that she couldn't concentrate on it. Her thoughts kept going back to Daddy and the problem. She got up and looked out of the window, trying to play one of her favorite games. Each time a Third Avenue L train rushed past, she would try to imagine where the people in it had come from and where they were going. That evening she couldn't pretend. All she could do was think about how awful it would be if Daddy got sick and Mommy had to go to work. She could hear Grandma mumbling in the kitchen. Grandma always mumbled when she put up the ironing board. It had a way of collapsing when she thought it was up to stay. Usually Mommy washed on Monday and Grandma ironed the clothes on Tuesday, but this had been such a rainy week that the washing had been postponed. Mommy came into the living room carrying her sewing box and a pair of Mike's pants. The room was very quiet and Dot was very lonely. She was so lost in her own thoughts that she jumped when the bell rang. "I'll press the button," Grandma called. "You go to the door." Who could it be? Dot wondered. Probably a delivery boy who had rung the wrong bell. She could hear the tick, tick, tick that released the downstairs door. She opened the upstairs one and waited. She heard footsteps climbing upward. Soon she heard a familiar voice saying, "There is someone at home?" The voice still had an accent, but it wasn't as noticeable as it had been the first time Dot heard it back in February. Dot's loneliness vanished immediately. She hoped Pierre would stay and talk, even though Mike and the girls weren't at home. What was the magazine under his arm, she wondered. Pierre came in, shook hands with Mommy, and looked around for the others. It was unusual to have so few Flemings at home. "Come in and say hello to me, Pierre," called Grandma. Dot led her guest into the kitchen. Grandma's plump cheeks were pinker than ever because of the heat. Her brown eyes glowed with affection for Pierre. "I'm not exactly dressed to receive guests, am I?" she said, drying her hands on her clean handkerchief before she shook hands with Pierre. Pierre looked at her with love and admiration. Neither Dot nor the other Flemings understood just why Grandma had a special place in Pierre's heart. It was because she had been the first person in this country who had kissed him. His aunt and uncle and his cousins had shaken hands and tried to look pleased to welcome him, but it was Grandma Fleming who had kissed him the way his mother had in France. "When I become a famous artist, may I have the privilege of painting you as you stand over the ironing board?" he asked her. "I thought you were going to be a great poet," Grandma said, going back to her ironing. "Oh, no," Pierre told her. "Dot will be the great poet and I will be the great artist." He sounded as sure as if he were saying, "Today is Saturday." His confidence made Dot feel hopeful, too. Grandma told them to go back into the living room where it was cooler, and she'd be there in a few minutes with soda and cookies. "It's not going to be such a dull evening after all," thought Dot. She noticed that Pierre was still clinging to his magazine. Back in the living room she half closed the windows because the roar of the L trains, combined with the noises from the radio shop next door, drowned out their conversation. Pierre wanted to know where everyone was, and he listened with interest when Dot told him. He said that he had been delivering orders all day and that he had come here because he wanted something very pleasant and restful to do in the evening. "Everyone works but me," said Dot. "I wish I could earn some money." "You'll have years and years to work in," Mommy said. "You may as well be carefree while you can." Carefree. Dot turned the word over in her mind. It seemed a long time since she had really been carefree. She knew that she would never be again until she was sure that Daddy would be well. Grandma came in carrying a tray with a plate of crackers and 4 glasses of golden brown cream soda. Each glass of soda had a thin layer of tiny bubbles on top. They made a sizzling sound. Suddenly, some of the bubbles shot up and the spray hit Grandma's face. The other 3 laughed at her surprised look. Pierre went over to Grandma and took the tray from her. He passed the soda first to her, then to Mommy, then to Dot. When he was in front of Dot, he said something in a very low voice. It sounded like 30. Dot looked at him questioningly, but Pierre's face was a blank. Had he really said 30? And if he had, what in the world had he meant? At 9, Pierre left. Mike, who had come home, walked to the door with him so that Dot didn't have a chance to ask what he had meant. She probably had misunderstood anyway. In spite of the half-open windows, the living room was hot and sticky. Probably Pierre had said thirsty. The more Dot thought about it, the more sure she felt that he had said exactly that. Thirsty and not 30. "Pierre left the magazine," said Grandma, straightening the room. "It's an old magazine, and it's for women, so I guess he meant to leave it." A thought struck Dot. Could Pierre have wanted her to look on page 30? She asked Grandma and Mommy if they wanted to read the magazine, and when they said they didn't, she took it into her bedroom. Before she started to undress, she turned the smooth pages with their beautiful advertisements to page 30. She breathed a big sigh of disappointment. There was nothing on it but words, not even a picture. Dot knew now that Pierre had really said thirsty. She put the magazine on her dresser and started to undress. Dot took off her dress and put it on the hanger. She took off one shoe and one stocking. Just as she unlaced the other shoe, the desire to go back to the magazine was more than she could bear. She knew that Pierre had said thirsty. She had just looked at the page, and yet... She hopped over to the dresser on the one foot that still wore the shoe. She turned to the uninteresting page that she had just looked at. Then she looked up at the top of the page, and her heart beat faster. Why, this was page 29. There was still hope. Dot didn't turn the page immediately. She wanted to postpone the feeling of disappointment that she knew was waiting for her. Then slowly she turned the page, but for a moment she didn't dare look at it. Then slowly she looked down, and again she breathed a sigh of disappointment. Page 30 was more interesting looking than page 29 had been, but that was all. On this page there was a colored advertisement, a picture of brown, crisp muffins. Dot read the big letters over the picture. "Do you use Muffin Masterpiece?" "I don't, and I never will," Dot said angrily to the smooth page. Somehow she felt ready to cry. She didn't know what she had expected, but she knew she was disappointed. Then she looked down at the wording under the picture of the muffins, and all the old hope returned. This is what it said: "Write a limerick telling why you use Muffin Masterpiece. The contest closes on September 1st, and the winners will be notified by Thanksgiving." There were paragraphs about enclosing the top of a Muffin Masterpiece box. The first prize, Dot read, was a choice of $10,000 in one sum, or $25 a week for 10 years. There were dozens of other prizes, all the way down to 6 prizes of $5 each. Dot's eyes looked at the list of prizes more hungrily than they did the pictures of the muffins. If she won, would she take the $10,000 or the $25 a week? She decided to take the $10,000. She had never known there was so much money in the world. It would solve Daddy's problem. Mommy could go down to Florida with him, while Grandma stayed home with the 4 younger Flemings. With $10,000, all of them could go to college. Mike could have a dog. She jumped into bed after turning out the light. Pierre was a good friend. He had realized that something was troubling Dot, and he guessed that it had something to do with money. He wanted her to enter the contest, and it was to give her confidence that he had said, "Dot is the poet." Suddenly, Dot remembered that the limerick must be in by September 1st. Today was August 17th. There was exactly 2 weeks left. 2 weeks in which to persuade Grandma to have hot muffins during these hot days, and to think of a limerick. Grandma would think she was crazy to suggest hot muffins. If only Dot could explain how eager Grandma would be to help. But Daddy had made her promise not to tell anyone. Lying there in the dark, Dot felt as if the days were rushing past her. She felt her confidence rushing past, too. One part of her said to the other in a clear, cold voice, "There will be thousands, maybe millions of people who will send in limericks. And they'll be better limericks than yours. You're a good poet for a girl 10 going on 11, but you're not as good as lots of grown-ups. If you're very, very lucky, you might win one of those $5 prizes, and that won't help Daddy a bit, although he and Mommy and all the others certainly will be pleased and surprised to think you won. But as sure as your name is Dorothea Ann Fleming, you won't win a cent. So there." The excitement that came with hoping, then losing hope, made Dot feel very tired. Soon she was so fast asleep that she did not hear Peg come into the room or see the light. Chapter 9. Hot Muffins for Supper. On Sunday morning 4 of the Flemings had a great deal to tell the others as they all sat around the breakfast table. The 4 were the ones who had worked Saturday evening. Mike told how many tips he had received and how one woman had treated him to a cold glass of ginger ale. Fluff told about the baby she had taken care of and how about the baby's very nice mother and father. Daddy, buttering his toast, had a certain twinkle in his blue eyes that meant only one thing. He had something especially interesting that he was waiting to tell. When Fluff finished telling her story, Daddy said, "Guess who drove down to the Pennsylvania station in the cab last night?" "The President!" shouted Mike. Dot stopped eating and waited eagerly to see if Mike was right. "No, not the President, Mike," said Daddy. "But you're not far wrong. He was the congressman from this district, the guy I voted for last November." Mike's long whistle showed how excited he was. All the others stopped eating and waited for more details. As usual, Daddy, knowing how interested and eager they were, took his time about telling his story. He ate a piece of toast slowly. He drank his coffee. He wiped his lips with his napkin. No one said anything, but 6 pairs of eyes looked straight at Daddy. It was Dot who broke the quiet. "Did you talk to the congressman?" she asked. She knew that Daddy and his passengers always had long conversations, usually about their families. Would Daddy talk about his family with a congressman? "You bet we talked," Daddy told them all. "He was going to Washington, D.C. He said it's even hotter there than it is here. Know what that guy told me? That he was born and grew up right on 3rd Avenue, on the next block. I told him where we lived, and he said when he was a kid he used to envy the kids who lived in this house because there was a bathroom in every apartment. In his house there was only one bathroom to every floor." Mommy's eyes glowed as if she were thinking of something very pleasant. "It's a wonderful country we're living in," she said. "No one is too poor to rise. Imagine a congressman from the next block. That ought to teach you a lesson, Mike." "It ought to teach you a lesson too, Mommy," said Mike very seriously. "I bet that congressman didn't have to take a bath every night, the way you make me. Not if there was only one tub for the whole floor." Mike looked as if he wanted to move into the other building as soon as he could. Everyone roared with laughter, and Mike, who hadn't meant to be funny, looked very pleased with himself. Now Peg took up the conversation. She told about a boy, a junior in her school, who had come into the 5 and 10 cent store, recognized her, and come back later to walk home with her. Then she turned to Dot and said, "Say, Dot, when I got home last night you were mumbling something. I thought you were talking to me, so I listened. Know what you said?" "I don't remember," Dot said hesitantly. She hoped it wasn't something about Pierre. If it was, Fluff and Peg would never stop teasing her, and Mike might even tell Pierre. "You were mumbling something about $10,000, said Peg. "You said it over and over again. $10,000. Grandma said that was quite a heap of money, and it must be very nice to have it. She wondered what made Dot dream about money." Dot knew, but she did not explain. She wished someone would change the subject. Daddy's eyes had a faraway expression as he tapped his spoon on the table and said, $10,000. "It would solve a lot of problems, I suppose," said Mommy. "But it would bring 10,000 more. I'm not sure I want it." Daddy looked at Dot and grinned. "When you go to bed tonight, kid, you get the $10,000 and we'll take care of the problems." "We'd better forget the $10,000 and remember the housework," said Mommy, getting up and starting to clear the table. In a minute they were all in different parts of the apartment, tidying the house. This Sunday it was Dot's turn to straighten her room, and it was Peg's turn to help Grandma with the dishes. Dot asked Peg if she'd like to change turns and let her help Grandma. Peg looked at all the breakfast dishes, thought of the tiny bedroom, and agreed before Dot could change her mind. Alone in the hot kitchen with Grandma, Dot said to her, "Did you ever use Muffin Masterpiece?" "What in the world is that?" asked Grandma. Dot explained that it was a mixture for making muffins. All you had to do was add a little water or something simple like that, and in a few minutes you had muffins. Dot hadn't read the instructions carefully enough to be able to tell them. She had been too busy thinking of the $10,000. Grandma shook her head so emphatically that her silver curls danced over her damp forehead. No, she said, she hadn't used Muffin Masterpiece or any of those newfangled products. She didn't believe in cooking that way. She liked to watch the milk and eggs and baking powder go into things. Maybe she was old-fashioned, but no one could call her lazy. And she defied anyone to make better muffins than she did. While she talked, Grandma was polishing the silverware so hard that Dot was glad it wasn't china. In the middle of an angry stroke, she looked up at Dot and said, "May I ask why, on a hot August day, you suddenly developed an interest for hot muffins?" For 1 minute, Dot was tempted to tell Grandma everything. It would be such a relief to have someone else share her problem. And unless she told, Grandma would think she was crazy to ask for hot muffins in this weather. If only Pierre had brought the magazine in May, when it first appeared! Then Dot could have suggested hot muffins without being embarrassed. If only Pierre had brought the magazine in May or even June or July, Dot would have had much more time to prepare her limerick. But she had promised Daddy not to tell anyone, and she must keep her promise. She looked up at Grandma with pleading eyes. "I can't explain why, but it's almost a matter of life and death. Could we have muffins made of muffin masterpiece sometime very soon? It's very, very important." Grandma kept looking at Dot with a puzzled expression. Usually she could read her mind as if it were an open book. Now, though, there was something on it that she could not understand. She did realize that whatever worried Dot was important, and that she must not ask questions. "Well," said Grandma, "I thought we'd have some nice cool salad for supper, but we could have muffins with it, instead of bread. You'll have to go to Jenkinson's for the masterpiece, or whatever you call it. He's the only grocer open on Sunday." Dot put down the towel that she had been using to dry the dishes. She stretched to her very tallest and threw her arms around Grandma's neck. She felt Grandma's soft cheek next to hers. She knew that Grandma did not think she was crazy. She trusted her. "You're the nicest grandma in the world," Dot said, "and you won't be sorry. You might even be glad." The feeling of hopefulness that had come and gone last night was back again. The day grew hotter and hotter. None of the Flemings had enough energy to do anything but sit and read, or just sit. Daddy took off his shirt, and Dot realized when she saw him in his undershirt how very thin he had become. Mommy realized it too. She said anxiously, "Jim, you don't look well. You ought to see a doctor." Daddy said that no one looked well in hot weather. He told Mommy that even she didn't look her best either, but he was too polite to tell her so. He walked over to the window and threw it open. Summer always brought with it the window problem. If you opened the window wide, you felt as if the Third Avenue L trains were rushing right into your living room. Somehow in hot weather they always sounded louder and closer than ever. Dot looked out of the window. Third Avenue, usually so crowded and lively, looked deserted today. There were hardly any people walking along the street. The passing L trains looked more than half empty. On Sundays like this one, people went to the beaches or to the air-conditioned moving picture houses, or they stayed home, as all the Flemings were doing. If she won the $10,000, thought Dot, all of them could take a taxi down to Music Hall and Radio City and sit in the air-conditioned theater all day. If! How silly she was to think there was even a chance. She was foolish to spend Daddy's money on the muffin masterpiece. Just as she was telling herself this, she seemed to hear two voices almost at the same time. One was real, the other was imaginary. The real voice was Mommy's, and it was urging Daddy to lie down in the bedroom where it was cooler. Mommy's voice sounded very worried. The imaginary voice was Pierre's, and it was saying, with its pleasant French accent, what it had said to Grandma last night. "Dot will be the great poet." Pierre had confidence in her. "I think I'm going for a walk," Dot said weakly, knowing how surprised everyone would be. And they were. They looked at her in amazement. "I knew the heat got you when you said you'd dry the dishes," Peg told her. Mommy asked if it was something very urgent, and at the same time Mike, stretched out on the sofa reading the comics, told Dot that she was plain nuts. Just at that moment Grandma went into the kitchen for a glass of water. She took 15 cents from the house money and gave it to Dot without anyone noticing. Out of doors the sun burned more fiercely than Dot had imagined. The heat attacked her from all sides. It rose from the pavement. It pressed down on her from the back. It came rushing toward her from the front. Dot found it hard to breathe. Maybe the wisest thing to do would be to forget the muffins and go upstairs again. As she stood in front of the building, wondering whether to go to Jenkins's, Mrs. Keller came from her basement apartment. Mrs. Keller was the fat, friendly janitress. Now her face was red and the perspiration was rolling down her forehead. She mopped it with the back of her plump hand. Dot said hello to her, and Mrs. Keller leaned against the side of the building. "It's as hot outside as it is in," she said. "I thought I'd get a breath of air if I came out. How's your pa, Dot? He ain't been looking well lately. Thin. He's a nice, friendly gentleman, and I'd sure hate to see anything happen to him." That decided Dot to go to the grocery store, although the thought of 4 blocks seemed as tiring as 4 miles. She passed a swarm of flies nibbling at a piece of orange peel that some careless person had thrown on the street. They buzzed noisily as they worked. Mr. Jenkins, sitting behind his counter, didn't seem at all pleased to see a customer. He looked too hot and weary to get up from the high stool on which he was sitting. As he gave Dot the box, he said, "Lots of people been buying this the last few months." Oh dear, thought Dot. That meant that even in this neighborhood lots of people were sending in limericks. Well, it was too late to change her mind. She had spent the money, and now she must try to win at least the $5 prize. The flies were still buzzing around the orange peel when Dot passed. She wondered if they had problems too, like human beings. Upstairs, the apartment was very quiet. Daddy was lying down, and the others were talking in low voices, so they wouldn't disturb him. Dot left the box in the kitchen. Then she went into the living room and agreed with Mike that she had been foolish to go out. When Grandma went into the kitchen for another glass of water, Dot said she wanted one too. In the kitchen she reminded Grandma to save the box top for her. Grandma nodded, and both of them felt like conspirators. On the supper table that evening there was a platter of leftover meat, a platter of potato salad, and a dish of sliced tomatoes. Daddy said this was a perfect meal for a hot night. Mike shouted to Grandma, who was still in the kitchen, "Grandma, you forgot the bread! The butter's here, but no bread!" Knowing how surprised they were all going to be, Dot thought it would help Grandma if she prepared the others. "We're going to have hot muffins instead of bread," she said. She tried to make her voice sound casual, but it cracked a little. "Hot muffins!" exclaimed one after the other, and just as the last one said it, Grandma came in from the kitchen carrying a dish of steaming muffins. Her face looked as hot as the muffins. She put the plate down in the middle of the table, breathed a big sigh, and sat down. Dot felt very sorry for Grandma. She reached for a muffin and dropped it on her plate in a hurry, because it was so hot. After a second or two she broke it and buttered it. All the other Flemings stared at her. No one said anything. Dot took a bite, determined to say it was good no matter how it actually tasted. That would make Grandma feel better. She did not have to pretend. The muffin was delicious. While the others looked at her as if she were an actor on stage or an animal in the zoo, Dot finished her muffin. "It's very good," she told the others. "You'd better try them while they're hot. The paper says it's better for your health to eat hot things in hot weather than ice things." For Dot, who was usually so quiet, this was a long speech, and she felt a little foolish making it. She hoped it would help Grandma a little. What's more, she'd really had read about hot things in the newspaper. Mike said he'd try anything once, and he reached for a muffin. He took a bite. His blue eyes brightened, and he smacked his lips. "Golly, it's swell!" he announced. Then, turning to Grandma, he said he thought it was mighty swell of her to get all heated up just so they could have muffins. Grandma looked pleased for the first time since she had come into the room. One by one the Flemings helped themselves to muffins. They agreed that the muffins were delicious and that Grandma was very nice to prepare them on such a hot day. Grandma's eyes began to recover their happy expression, but Daddy looked puzzled. He looked at Dot once or twice as if he wondered what she was up to. That evening, while the rest of the family listened to the radio, Dot went into the bedroom. She wrote, she crossed out. She started over again. She thought of everything good that her family had said about the muffins. The little room was very hot, but Dot did not notice. She was so lost in thought that she did not once hear the 3rd Avenue L trains rush past. After a while she decided to put the limerick away and look at it again tomorrow. When she went back into the living room, Dot heard Daddy saying that he wished the congressman could have been there for dinner and sampled those muffins. Grandma looking very pleased and happy. said that Dot would have to share the praise because the muffins had been her idea. Well, thought Dot, even if we don't get a penny, those muffins made a hit.